Welcome, everybody, to Two Drunk Dudes in a Gun Room. Today, I've got Jarrod Taylor, author of No Shit, Here I Am. All right. Hey, how you doing, Jarrod?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Hey, I'm doing great, man. So, Fort Drum, huh?
Yeah.
Man, it's
I
cold.
went, I went from Fort Drum to Schofield Barracks though. So
Oh, wow. You get it from both ends.
oh yeah.
So, tell me a little bit, what made you decide to go in the military?
You know, I grew up always interested in the military. I was reading a lot of books about Vietnam and putting together model tanks and even before that I was playing with the little green army men, out in my driveway and all that. Um, then I learned that my dad had served. I found his uniform one day in his closet, and I was just like, "Wow, this is so cool." Had no idea, and he never really talked much about what he did in the army or anything, other than he was a tanker and was in Germany for a while.
Okay.
Um, but I was always interested, and I ended up, getting into high school JROTC, and I love that. And honestly, I kind of chickened out after high school, and then I was about 20, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. So went in and enlisted.
Okay. What year did you come in again?
2000.
2000. So you were in about 2 years, almost three before 9/11 started, huh?
Yeah, so I was at Fort Drum on when 9/11 happened.
And that was your first duty assignment?
Yep,
Where'd you go to basic at?
Fort Benning in Georgia.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Did
Were you,
infantry basic there, and then I went to jump school, and I actually had started a RIP contract to go to Ranger Regiment, and then I kind of, I quit about halfway through. So it is what it
okay.
is.
Hey, that shit ain't easy. You know, I did I did 10 years in the 160th, and I was
Okay.
getting old and getting closer to retirement, and got ready to leave, and they offered me a position over at the 75th. And I only had one question, do I have to go to Ranger school? They said, yeah. I said, I'll go back to the regular army. I'm
Yeah, that
too
was something.
I'm too old for that stuff.
Even though I didn't go to regiment, and there was more to it, I was engaged to be married to my still wife, and they were telling me, they're like, bro, you can't be married as a private in Ranger Battalion and all
Yeah.
that, and they kind of psyched me out a little bit, but I still always wanted to go to Ranger school, and then once we started deploying so much, I was like, I don't think I'm going to volunteer for more time away than I already have to spend.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Anytime you're with a USASOC unit, man, that's just Latin for you're not going to be home. I, I learned that too, man. So 11 Bravo, your first assignment, you go to Fort Drum, man. What was your thoughts when you got orders to go to Drum?
I was glad it wasn't Korea.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's
You know,
where
they
I
kept
went for
telling
my
us.
first assignment.
Okay, so they kept telling us that, and I was thinking the same thing, honestly, like being engaged to be married. I was like, I can't go away for a year.
Yep.
Um, but honestly, I didn't even know where Fort Drum was. I just knew when they were calling out orders that day, there were like 17 of us that got orders, and they were like Korea, 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 and they got to me and they were like Fort Drum, and they all started laughing. Like all these instructors at
Yeah.
RIP started laughing at me. I had no idea why. I didn't know where it was, and they were like, "You're gonna freeze your butt off."
Yep. Yeah. Everybody I've talked to says that it's worse at Fort Drum than it is in Alaska.
I've heard that as well. I've never met anybody who's been to Alaska that didn't love it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I spent 20 years trying to get there and I never made it. But that was the one place I definitely wanted to go. So how long was you there before your first deployment?
I got there in September of 2000, so a year before 9/11. And then we actually deployed about a week after 9/11, stateside still. We went to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland just
Mhm.
because they wanted extra force protection along the East Coast.
Okay.
Um, we stayed there for about 45 days and then went back to Fort Drum, did kind of a refit and a little bit of training. And then we left for Uzbekistan at K2 um, in December of '01. And then when Operation Anaconda kicked off in March, we went from Uzbekistan into Afghanistan.
Yeah, going through your book, man, I was pretty sure that the timing was that so you were there for Anaconda then. That
Yeah.
was, and a lot of people for a lot of the civilians that um, don't really follow it, Anaconda was like the Super Bowl of battles. And the 20 years, I think that was one of the biggest operations. And then there was a bunch of that followed after that, but I mean, that was where the real fighting was taking place. You know.
Well, and I'll tell you, so we had a battalion from Fort Drum on the ground there, 187,
Mm-hmm.
and then we had the Rockassans from Fort Campbell with
Yep.
101st out there, and then of course you had all the special ops guys, the SEALs and Rangers and everybody in there. We got down there a few days after, like Neil Roberts had fallen out of the Chinook and it had gotten
Mm-hmm.
shot down. So we went down that day. We went to Afghanistan, went to Bagram, and then the next day we went out to the mountains. So things had settled down a little bit. I mean, we still had some like sniper fire, if you would want to call those guys snipers,
Yeah.
and we had some mortars and things like that. But really, it was the Rockassans and the 187 guys. I think got it a little bit worse than we did before we got there.
Yeah, I mean those units were known for those time frames. Um, you know, to paint a picture, so that area of Afghanistan is probably one of the harshest environments to have to navigate through between the mountains and the heat and the sandstorms. I mean, when when you're chasing somebody in those mountains, I mean, the odds are pretty good that you're going to be chasing an older guy, and he navigates these mountains like billy
Yeah,
goats. I mean, you're talking 50-year-old man climbing, walking up and running up these hills like it's nothing, and granted they didn't have the packs and the equipment and everything that we carried, but I don't think American soldiers was really ready for that. They weren't
you know,
expecting it.
I'll tell you, everybody was like, "Oh, you guys are 10th Mountain. You're trained for this." I'm like, "There's no mountains at Fort Drum."
Yeah.
I mean, there's some hills and stuff, but nothing like that. And they told us while we were there that we had the top of Tucker Gar, which is Roberts Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
They said it was at like 10,500 feet, and they're like, "We've not had conventional forces fighting this high before." We had guys
Yeah.
falling out with elevation sickness,
Oh
and
yeah.
we took the back plates out of our vests because they wanted us to cut down on weight. There was just like I don't know, and it was hot, and we got sunburnt, and then it snowed, and it was just a muddy mess, and I mean, it
Yep.
was pretty miserable time.
Yeah, yeah, it is rough fighting, man, and you go further down south, down Kandahar, and it completely changes. It becomes
Yeah,
what you picture Afghanistan to look like, the flat moon dust sand, you
yep.
know, and you get up north and it completely changes. I mean, there's some greenery, there's seasons. I mean, you would think that you weren't in a shithole until it reminds you.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So how long were you there? Did you guys stay?
We didn't actually. We got to Uzbekistan, like I said, in December, stayed there until March. In March, we went down, did Operation Anaconda, and then they flew us out. It was 160th actually that was flying us around.
Mhm.
We flew out a couple more times to the Shakot Valley, did a few quick missions, and then really we started packing up to go home. I think 82nd came in after us, and that's when they started doing rotations.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The Robert Ridge, the SEAL that died, that was on our aircraft as well. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
yeah.
Um. So you guys returned back stateside,
Yep.
and how long were you back in the States before? Because once this train starts, man, I'm 10th Mountain, 82nd, 101st, third ID. I mean, it was a nonstop rotation, man.
It was. So we got back, of course, did a rotation at JRTC. Um, and we got back. I'm trying to think. It was so March, we had the Black Hawk crash at Fort Drum where we lost 11 guys. And then May, I think it was like May 1st, we deployed to the Horn of Africa, Djibouti and Ethiopia.
Oh wow.
Uh, and so at the time, it was weird because we had a company deployed to Kuwait when we left for Operation or for Afghanistan the first time. Well, they were in Kuwait getting ready to go home, and they came to Afghanistan and went out on Operation Anaconda as well. And then they actually went home before us because they'd been gone for 6 months.
Hmm.
Uh, then when we deployed in 2003, our battalion was split again. We had a company go to Afghanistan, one go to Kuwait, and then into Iraq, and then one in with us in Africa, and our headquarters was split between us. So our battalion commander, both times, like his battalion was split up, and he was traveling from place to place just to check on people. But yeah, we spent from May of '03 until like October, November of '03 in Djibouti and making trips into Ethiopia and Kenya a little bit.
So, can you talk a little bit about the missions in Africa?
Yeah, so we were on Camp Lemonnier, which was a Marine base down there right on the coast. And originally they told us when we got there, they're like, so we believe that Taliban and even Al Qaeda at that point were traveling from Yemen back and forth through Djibouti into Somalia. And they were like, we've basically publicized that the same people from Operation Anaconda are here. So if you want to start something, now's the time. Um, Nothing ever really happened. There were some pop shots and all that here and there, but for the most part, we just did a lot of training. We had a company commander who was ordering Zodiacs and trying to get us to do some amphibious stuff, and we were fast roping out of Marine Sea Stallions.
Mm-hmm.
We did some security missions up in the capital Ethiopia in civilian clothes, so that was kind of fun, staying at a hotel and guarding dignitaries.
Oh yeah.
Our mission as a company was really not to make the Marines mad too often that we're there on camp, and a lot of training with with special forces guys again.
Yeah. I think a lot of people they don't understand, they see what's on the news and the news shows what sells. So a lot of people don't understand the things like for example, like when I was in Bosnia, we carried magazines. No ammo, but magazines. It's about showing a force but not necessarily having to use it.
Yeah,
No different than the psyops of telling the Taliban that you guys are there, but not necessarily having to do anything.
right.
That psychological warfare goes a long ways as well. And sometimes you can accomplish your mission without having to do that. And I think a lot of people don't really follow that side of it.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realized that this war extended into Africa, to
Yeah,
be
and I mean,
honest.
we still have quite a few people, I think, in the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, we did a lot of training and we did presence patrols and stuff down there, but we did humanitarian stuff too. We were training the Ethiopian army and we were traveling down there doing med caps. We were volunteering at an orphanage in the city of Djibouti. We were going down there playing with the kids and dropping off food and we were doing all kinds of stuff like that too that a lot of times people don't hear about in the news.
Yeah. I mean, if you think back, I think it was in the 90s, when pirating and everything was really bad, we were doing airdrops for supplies, but we were basically giving it to gangs
Yeah.
because the people weren't getting it. So I think that was another good thing about troops being on ground there was we could actually take taxpayers' money that's buying this stuff and actually use it for what it's designed for, to help people.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, there was a lot of good things to it, and it is kind of unfortunate that a lot of people don't know about Africa. If they do, they think of Black Hawk Down and Somalia.
Mhm.
That's what they think of in Africa. But we've had troops there for a long time doing a
Yeah.
lot of different things.
But yeah, and we got, people in the Sinai and all that. I mean, I remember Fort Drum guys doing a rotation there before all the war started.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, even thinking about Black Hawk Down, I mean, if you've read the book or seen the movie, like you see humanitarian aid,
Yep.
the food being dropped and the warlords taking control of it and murdering people over it. So
Yep.
yeah, it's rough over there too.
Yeah, it's a whole different lifestyle, and that's one thing as soldiers, it's the good and the bad. We see it and we don't necessarily come back and tell our families about how bad people are really living over there. But when
Yeah,
you see these people that are protesting war and everything else, and they haven't seen what people are capable of doing,
right.
you know, and you get a different perspective from our views, and yeah, that's what makes us who we are. But at the end of the day, um, it's unfortunate when they started adding all these news reporters. how much really got cut out and what they showed versus what was really going on over there.
Yep, absolutely.
So so you left Africa, you went back to Drum.
Yeah, I went back to Fort Drum and started packing to PCS to Hawaii. I
Oh,
had re-enlisted while I was in Africa, and my I can't even speak right now. My option was duty station of choice, and
yeah,
I talking to my wife, I'm like, "Where do you want to go?" And she was like, "Somewhere warm," and I was like, "Hawaii's open," so that's where we went.
yeah. You got to play in the red clay.
Yep, all that volcano rust.
Yep, everybody talks about how many uniforms they buy over there.
Yep, yep.
So, what did you think of Schofield?
I've always liked history, so it's kind of cool to be there because there's so much history.
Yeah.
Uh, a lot of guys get island fever, and they're like, "Man, I can't wait to get off this island." I was there. I actually re-enlisted to stay a little bit longer.
Okay.
I I could have stayed there forever if it wasn't so expensive. Like I
Yeah.
fell in love with the surfing and the beaches and the hiking trails and just, I mean, if I could be back near the ocean somewhere with palm trees, I would be there in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Yeah. I get it. And that's it. It's Hawaii is one of those places that you get. There's no middle ground. People either
Yep.
love it or they hated it. You
Yeah.
know, and you
Yeah.
can
I
always
fell in
know.
love.
You always know those guys when you first say it because you're like, "What'd you think of Ohio?" And he's like, "Well, I liked it for the first 30 minutes, and then I seen everything there is to see." Yeah,
Not me, not me. I could have stayed.
yeah. So did you deploy from Hawaii as well?
I did. So my first unit I was assigned to, it's funny because when I re-enlisted, I was like, man, I've already done 2 deployments. Like I'm going to go to Hawaii and take a break, right?
Yeah.
Well, Army Times posted 25th Infantry Division to deploy the first time in however many years. So I get there in January of '04, and my unit was 235 Infantry, and they were getting ready to go to Afghanistan in like April. Um, Sergeant Major pulled me in and he's like, I understand you just got back. Like, I'm going to give you the option to stay here if you want. Found out my wife was pregnant at the same time, so I decided to stay back. I did end up deploying in November of '04 to Afghanistan down to Kandahar area. So I was there from November of '04 until like April or May of '05.
Okay. What did you think of comparing the two regions? So since you've seen the both sides of Afghanistan.
It was different for sure. Like you mentioned, it wasn't, I mean, there were some hills and stuff around Kandahar, but it was not like if you were in the mountains, you were not climbing hand over hand in
Yeah.
snow, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, Kandahar City's built up and, I mean, there's a lot of mud houses, but they've all got satellite dishes on them and all that. But yeah, I mean, the airport seemed modern-ish,
Yeah.
compared to just being out in the boonies the first time I was there. So it was definitely a different part of the country, drier,
Yep.
hotter.
Yep. You can see the sandstorms rolling in. You're like, well, here in
Oh
about an hour, it's going to be orange.
yeah, right. Everything was covered in dust. Yeah.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about the mission differences. So compared to what you were doing in the northern region, what was the mission tempo like in the Kandahar region?
Yeah, it was funny because I got to Kandahar and our unit was basically like, "Hey, all you NCOs that just showed up, we don't actually need you, so like we're gonna task you out." But really, we had, when I first got to Bagram back in '02, we set up GP mediums
Yeah.
on Bagram. There was nothing there. I mean, we had canvas tents that we put sandbags around with potbelly stoves in them, no
Yep.
power. We threw plywood down on the ground for floors. And then when we went out to the mountains, they were like, anybody who is not hostile has already evacuated or ran away or whatever. They're like, if you see somebody, they are fair game, you can shoot. That was our rules of engagement.
Yeah.
Um, my third deployment when I was in Kandahar, we had a company out at Kalat. We had our HHC mostly at Kandahar, and then we had another company. I can't even remember where they were at. And then our Charlie company was out starting to get into the hills where there was some snow and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but really, they were patrolling their sectors and they were doing. I mean, still the humanitarian stuff and all that, but like they were doing more of like presence patrols and just running their AO like everybody did. Um, really a lot of wheeling and dealing with the local warlords, just
Yeah.
trying to keep the peace, I think. I ended up, after being there for a little while and running supplies and flying supplies back and forth to all those bases, um, I ended up being assigned to a National Guard unit temporarily. I was tasked to them to run the gate to Kandahar. So then, really, I was just doing security every morning with about 35 soldiers that were tasked to me from different units.
Yeah.
Uh, so then we were stopping weapons and cell phones and hashish from
Yeah.
from coming into the base. That was kind of my main function, and it was not my favorite time in the army, but I at least got to sleep in a bed every night.
Yeah. And it plays an important role. I mean, there's I don't know how many times I'd be walking a national around and you'd catch them pace counting or trying to get in places that they're not supposed to be just to observe and look, and this intel's leaving,
Yeah.
and you could always tell when you're going to have some rockets coming too, because the local national numbers at the gate are slim to none. You're like,
Right.
oh, y'all are the idiots that didn't get the memo, huh?
Yep. And we caught a guy one time leaving with he had a bag full of snacks and he had a box of Cracker Jacks in his bag
Mhm.
and a tape recorder in the Cracker Jacks.
Yeah.
And it was just like we caught him on the way out, and of course we detained him and sent him up with the MPs to get questioned and all that. But it was just like, of all the things, like this guy's got a tape recorder and a box of popcorn.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look at the in Mosul, there was a case while I was over there. There was a worker that worked at the chow hall there that an SF guy caught him up on top of the roof with a signaling mirror. He had a little glass mirror, and if you know
But
anything, at some point that chow hall did end up getting hit, you
yep.
know,
Well, that
and
was one of the things that I actually confiscated when they came through the gate with my detail. I was like, no flashlights, no cell phones, no mirrors, no knives.
yeah,
I mean, it was anything they could signal with or anything that they could inflict damage with.
yeah, and it is absolutely crazy, you know, when you've been in as long as I have, you watch these bases just transform. I remember Kandahar right after we took it over, and I got there shortly after that. And the last time I left Kandahar, you could have a pizza delivered to your tent. I mean, it was
Wow.
literally that big of a change.
I believe it. I mean, I remember, I'm trying to think of what we had on Kandahar. I remember we had the coffee shop. I can't, was it Green Bean or
Green beans.
something? Um, and there was a Subway and a McDonald's maybe or a Burger King or something in trailers, of course, and the food
Yeah,
wasn't the same, but like it was a nice PX and a decent barber shop and all that. And
yeah,
it's my first time, like I said, at Bagram, we didn't even have a chow hall for the first, I
yeah.
mean, probably few weeks that we were there, and then they started doing oh, I can't even the big pans of pre-prepared
The
food.
sea rations.
Yeah, sea ration. So they started doing those, after a little bit, and then actually before we left, they had set up a chow hall, but it was still, bare bones. It wasn't anything like going to the giant ones with all the coolers and the desserts, and it's all practically catered by third country nationals and all that.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a funny story. Well, part of it's funny. It's not all funny, but so in Kandahar, right? The Canadians were on the base there with us, and they took over basically the base needs. That their porta johns were starting to come in. And they were having a suck truck come in, and they were going to start using the porta johns once their equipment got there. They were going to run the chow hall and everything. And at this point, it was still 3 MREs a day. That's what you got. And then
Yep.
it went to two hots and an MRE, and the Canadians were running the MKT. And I had an E6, very young E6 that was over me. I was an E5 at the time, and he was like, "Man, I'm gonna go get some of those eggs." I said, "What are you talking about, man? Those ain't eggs." He said, "Well, yeah, they are." I said, "They are green." I said, "It is an MRE in boiled water." He didn't believe me. And the first time, and he was so mad when because he'd never seen sea rats before.
Yep.
I
Yep.
was in Bosnia before this, so I had seen this kind of food, and so I started laughing, and then we had some Air Force guys that they didn't follow the rules of engagement. They were denied permission to fire several times, and they ended up shooting and killing like 50 Canadian infantry guys. They were out their range. The range was still, I don't know where the burn pit was when you was there, but the range wasn't too far from where the burn pit became, and
Oh,
it was just an area up against some mounds and mounds, and they claimed they seen fire, and what they seen was tracers bouncing off the
yep,
of the things. But the next day it was back to 3 MREs a day, and the cooks and everything. They ended up having to pull perimeter guards and stuff
yeah,
like that because they just
that's
lost
all.
it. Yeah, it was horrible. And we had a huge memorial and everything, man. I didn't even hold my head up, man, because I just felt like, I mean, that was one of our guys that did some
Yeah,
stupid shit like that.
I know we had. I mean, thinking back to Africa, even we had soldiers out on a range, and they had everywhere we flew. We either were in Air Force CH-53s or Marine ones, um, and they had landed on these like plateau things over
Mhm.
near the water, and guys were out training. I think they were doing mortars or something, and the Air Force was out there doing practice bombing runs and dropped cluster bombs on the helicopters. I
Oh
don't know how they
wow.
did it. They killed a Marine pilot, and then wounded a handful of other guys. And our guys are like, the freaking Air Force is bombing us.
Yeah.
I wasn't out there that day, but like I went to the memorial service for the pilot, and it's just like was not my first training accident that had resulted in someone dying, but I couldn't believe that like a messed up bombing run on a training mission, ended up bombing two Marine helicopters.
Yeah. I mean, you would think the Army and the Marines would be the trigger happy, and we can't wait to pull the trigger. But I'm
Right.
gonna tell you, I really think the Air Force took that award. I really do. And I do get it. So you think about, let's say you're a pilot, you know, realistically, when was the last time we had a pilot have to do their job?
Yeah.
So it's rare to talk to a pilot that was in a fight, you know,
Yep.
up to this point, when the war first started. So to want to be that guy that sets yourself apart, I do get that, but not at the safety of everybody else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was telling my wife here recently when the pilot shot down that first balloon over the East Coast, I was like, that pilot was like, hell yes.
Yeah, even though it was a balloon, that was me. I'm that guy.
Yeah.
Yep. But I think our Apache pilots, fall in that same category. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I've been on the ground when an AC-130, fired their 105 or whatever it is that got on there. That was impressive. I
yeah,
mean,
it
that
sure
dropped
is.
the ground where we were standing, And I mean, during Anaconda, like they were dropping bombs left and right, and I mean, they had Marine Cobras out there firing everything they
Yeah,
had, Apaches firing everything they had, and A-10s were out there running. I mean, it was impressive watching that, especially at
yeah.
night.
Oh,
It's like,
A10s are amazing. They are
yeah,
amazing.
I love watching those guys.
Yeah. And that's what I was saying, I mean, I think, to be honest, I don't know if at that point, I think we kind of thought that we were just going to go in there and win this war and move on out and head on home. And that's
Yeah,
why there was so much logistics that went into that. I mean, like I said, the CIA was there,
mhm,
the SEALs, SF, Rangers, infantry. You know, I mean, it was all hands on deck, and it
yeah,
it lasted. What was it? Like March 1st through March 18th or something like that. So it was,
yeah. It was something like that. I mean, we were out there for our first time out in the mountains. We went out for they told us to prepare for 3 days, and we were out for about nine. So running out of food and everything. But yeah, like I said, we got there a little bit late, so the other guys had already been out there. I think probably 5 or 6 days.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we even tried to bring tanks in there. Well, it was Afghanis that were using the tanks, but I mean,
Yeah, the
they
Northern
didn't make it.
Alliance guys.
Yeah, they didn't make it very far. You
And
know,
that's actually I think that we ended up That's we were waiting on them actually, like
Yeah.
in a blocking position, and that's why we kept getting delayed because they kept getting delayed. But then I think that our Air Force bombed them too on their way. Actually, I think they killed
Yeah.
some Northern Alliance guys and maybe wounded some SF guys that were trying to get into the valley.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, there was so many incidents like that with the Air Force. I mean, I get it. The way Afghanistan ended, none of us really hold our head high. But if I was in the Air Force, I would really not hold my head high. There was some serious mistakes at some high levels. And we're not talking about E4s flying these things. I mean, these are
Right, right.
these are all officers. I guess, land navigation's a bitch.
Although I'll tell you, when they were on, they were on.
So you didn't hear these stories about A-10 pilots. That's for damn sure. I mean,
Yeah,
you you,
right.
you give them an area, and man, they can hit it. You
Yeah.
know,
We had A-10s at Fort Drum. There was a small, I don't know, squadron or flight of them there. And even when we'd be out training when I was a young soldier, we'd see them off in the distance doing gun runs and stuff and
yeah,
just, practicing. And it was just like, wow, that's incredible.
yeah, yeah. I have nothing bad to say about those guys, man. They are definitely awesome. And the C-130s. Not a lot of people get to see them fire, but if you ever do,
Yeah.
whether it be a gunnery or in war, like you said, it is impressive. You
Yeah,
know.
I'm not gonna lie, when that spotlight came out of the sky in the dark, I was like, we had our little reflective tabs, and I was definitely like, please don't shoot us.
You mean you didn't have the one on top of your
Oh
your
yeah, we
hammer?
had that one too, but
You have to look. Did I have it covered? No. Okay.
right. Well, yeah, and I mean, that was back in DCU, so I think it was like glint tape safety pin to the.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely, man. So like everybody else. I mean, Afghanistan. You have it's like nothing happening to balls to the walls, right? So
Yeah.
in that downtime, man, what are some of the funny ass things that you soldiers would do just to eat up time?
Oh my gosh. I'm trying to even think. You always had the guys that play guitars and stuff, and
Oh yeah.
we had my first time in Afghanistan. There were some Royal Marine Commandos there from the United Kingdom, and I remember one of those guys walking around in the fog in the morning wearing a kilt playing bagpipes.
Now, I've never heard a story like that.
It was like we're sitting in our tent and we're like, where the hell are these bagpipes coming from? This is kind of creepy. Um, but I've got one of my soldiers. I was a machine gunner on that first deployment, and my assistant gunner was in some magazine, and I forget what magazine it was, but he was playing volleyball, and people are like, "You're in Afghanistan, and that's what you're doing. You're playing volleyball."
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm trying to think. I mean, oh gosh, when I was in Kandahar that second time, because I was running the gate, I had a pickup truck. I took that thing mudding outside the gate all the time. I think I ramped a bus on a hill one time, and of course it's like a 5 speed. All those
Toyota
trucks.
Hilux.
Yeah,
Yep.
right hand drive. We
Yep.
had one actually that we had stolen from somewhere, and I don't know. The guys in my platoon had managed to hotwire it, so you just used a screwdriver to start it, and it had so many leaks in it. We'd pour oil in, and it would run right out the bottom, but we couldn't get it serviced because it wasn't on anyone's books.
Yeah.
Uh, but it would not hold any fluids, but it also would never die. Like it just kept rolling.
Well, I'm gonna tell you, man. These people over there, they're not dumb. They know how to survive. They've been fighting wars way longer than the United States has, and
Yeah.
um, I learned that when I was in Iraq. The last time, but my last deployment, I was in Ramadi, and we had to teach the Iraqis that were in Fallujah logistics. That's what we were doing. So we were over there managing their supplies and you know setting priorities for which units would get which parts and whatever. And we would always take our junk, whatever we didn't want to throw away and burn, we just throw it up in a trailer and take it to them, and they'd go through it. So they had a popcorn machine, like what you see in the movie theaters,
Mhm.
that they had rigged up to test injectors. So they had diesel running through it, and at the top where the kernels would sit to pop,
Yeah.
they had a bar running across with a fuel line plugged into injectors, and they could fire each individual injector and watch the spray. And
Uh,
I was like, holy crap, man.
that's that's crazy. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember seeing some stuff like that when I was in Uzbekistan. Some of the cars they were driving, you could
Yeah.
tell were pieced together from whatever they could find. When I was in Africa, it was like people were living in the desert, and their homes were made out of like pieces of boats and cars and whatever else they could find.
Yeah.
Um, then I was in Iraq in from '07, December of '07 to January of '09, and same situation there, and we were north of Taji, north of Baghdad,
Yeah.
in a rural area. So we saw lots of that, lots of, ingenuity and just like trying to figure out ways to live. But then it was crazy because when we went into Sadr City, I mean, everybody had like all the modern stuff. It was like being in any American city. And I was just like, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, in that area, I mean, you were in some pretty rough neighborhoods, man, because that area, man, they got bombed a lot. I
Yeah.
mean, you'd see in the intel meetings, and there'd be like, oh, we've had two strikes over here, three strikes over here, and then in that whole area, it just looked like somebody put all the darts in one spot, man.
Yeah, and you mentioned being in Afghanistan and having it go from like 0 to 100 miles an hour. Like that's kind of how it was in Iraq for us. I mean, we had done some raids up north in the
Mhm.
country, and we found some IEDs and things like that. But really, there was just not much action. Like we were bored, and then it was March of '08. We got a call to report back to our JSS after being on patrol. We had found an IED, and we were waiting on EOD to come deal with that. Um, and they called us and they're like, get back to Taji, pack as much ammo as you can and stand by. So we're like, what are we
Holy
doing?
shit.
Well, then we got the mission brief that basically, the Mahdi militia was firing all these rockets into the green zone from Sadr City. So we were going to go down there and help, I think it was 1-2 SCR deal with that. And we were in a striker unit at that point. So we went down, stopped at Old Mod. Our officers all went and got briefed on the situation. They've formulated a plan to do some raids on some suspected firing points. And then we went out like 3 in the morning, hit some different houses, and of course my email would pop up. um, but we hit some different houses and we were watching, just waiting for somebody to try to come and fire rockets into the green zone across the river.
Yeah.
Um, and then, it's like as daylight came, like gunfire was just everywhere, but it was all a few blocks away. I remember my squad, they're like, this sucks. We're stuck on this rooftop and third platoon's over there getting into shit. But I mean, it wasn't long before they were like, hey, like our tires are flat. We're running out of fuel. Like we need somebody to come in here. So like we got called to go in there. And it was like from the first day in Sadr City, we were there for 45 days, and probably the first half of it was fighting in the streets and constant IEDs and rockets and really it was what I expected combat to be like,
Yeah.
and then it was really cool though, because while we were there, we went from nobody was out. I mean, garbage was burning in the streets. I remember there was a dead donkey that had been caught in the middle of gunfire,
Hmm.
and all this stuff going on. And by the time we left, just 45 days later, businesses were open, kids were out kicking soccer balls around, and it's like, well, we did something here.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, a lot of people don't think of the things that get caught in the middle of those fire. I mean, the little stuff that people don't think of, they just think of the two people that are fighting, but there's still people that live there that have nothing to do with this, kids and everything else.
Yeah.
The one thing I remember from Bosnia that always bothered me was you never seen kids playing in grass. If it wasn't hard concrete, they didn't walk on it. And it was
yeah.
because they were taught at a young age, because there were still so many unfound landmines around and nobody knew where they were. And when it would rain and flood, things would move, so
Hmm.
you never knew. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the
I mean,
kid would walk on
Afghanistan's the
it.
same way. Like
Yeah.
you stay on the road.
Yep.
But
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about IEDs, right? So when you're on these patrols, what are some of the different types of IEDs that you've seen? Give everybody kind of an idea of how creative these guys can be.
I think the most common things that we found were usually artillery shells that were taped together and had det cord stuffed in the tip of them with a blasting cap.
Okay.
Um, those are probably the most common that we found. We saw some crushed wire ones where it was Christmas lights, with the wire. They were attached to explosives and then had some wire stripped where, you know, if the two wires touched each other after if you drove over it or stepped on it, it would set it off.
Okay.
Saw some of those. We saw the EFPs, which is like the copper disc that's going to melt and penetrate your
Yeah.
armor.
Yeah.
We were finding those in Sadr City some. I had an IED up near Taji. It was about 50 pounds of homemade explosives. So it was basically fertilizer buried in the ground, but it was command detonated. So some guy sitting on the other end of a wire touched a battery to it when we drove over it
Yeah.
and put up under our truck. Um, you know, Probably the most scary were the EFPs because
Yeah.
we knew they would penetrate your armor and they were concealed pretty easily because they'd put them in like a cement block or something and you had no idea. Um, and then the probably another scary thing for me is we found well actually we got a call from a local one time that they had found a bomb and it was some old Russian like dropped from a plane like huge probably 250-pound bomb that they had found out in the woods, but that was right where I hit that IED. And I
Oh
was just,
wow.
it was like just off the trail where I hit it. And I was just like, man, like that could have gone way different.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Man, and IEDs, trying to keep up with technology, you would see, the Duke systems and the jammers and everything that we were using. I don't remember what they're called, but the long poles just to take down the wires that they would run
Yeah.
across the bridges and shit, you know, and the little things that you'd say, okay, wake up today. Let's what's one unusual way they could try to kill us today, and then try to combat it. But again, like you say, you're on a patrol, you're moving, let's say you're doing 30, 35 miles per hour, trying to identify every little object in the ground in the sand. It's
Oh yeah.
impossible. You just can't do it, you
Yeah.
know?
I remember walking on patrol in Sadr City and I saw a wire running into a pothole and the pothole was filled with gravel. And EOD or route clearance just happened to be nearby. So I would just kind of waved and pointed down and like, the guy, I don't even remember what that skinny little vehicle's called, Rhino or something,
Oh yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
I don't
I
know,
know
but
what you're
like
talking about.
it looks like a road grader, but
Yep.
doesn't have blades on it. And like he like pulls up next to me, and I pointed to where the wire was at, and he like gives me a thumbs up, and then backs up and drives over it 2 or 3 times, and then looks at me and gives me a thumbs up again and drives away. And I'm like, I don't want that guy's job.
No, yeah. I've always said the same thing, when they do route clearing and stuff, that is the worst job because they drive like 10 miles per hour. I mean, it is super slow, and your whole job is to run over explosives. I
Yeah.
mean,
And I mean, I saw some of those guys in Solder City that had been hit with EFPs, and I remember just seeing a hole. I mean, like this big through the vehicle, and
yeah,
luckily it wasn't where the cabin was, so it had hit near the front of the vehicle, but it had gone all the way through, and I was just like, I don't want to mess with that.
yeah, yeah. No, that's the worst damn job, man. That and I seen some Ugandis that they had out there probing the grounds in these bomb suits. I was like, whew, I don't know what they're making, but it ain't enough.
Right, right.
But yeah, man, one of the things I always remembered from us was fucking with the wildlife. The camel spiders, the damn
Yeah,
sidewinders, the vipers, and all that stuff. So the soldiers was always catching something. Putting in a box and trying to make it fight. And
yeah. Scorpions. We
yep,
we had guys doing that. I remember guys doing that even in Hawaii with the centipedes out there because they're huge,
yeah,
and they do like centipedes and geckos, or I mean, whatever they could get a hold of. You're absolutely right.
yeah. The creativity a board soldier will have, you know, it's amazing.
I was
So
always amazed at the soldiers who got over there and bought a TV and a Xbox or a PlayStation, and then found enough scrap wood to build an entire entertainment center.
yeah, yeah. And then come back home and be the first ones going to AER because now they can't pay their bills.
Right, right.
They have no extra money. Yeah, it was like that. I think it's kind of bad to say, but I think soldiers got to the point where they were used to deployment money.
Yeah.
I mean, we made more deployed and we were deployed more than we were home. It kind of made
Yeah.
sense, and you'd see people like, man, when's our next deployment, man? My money's getting low, you know?
I knew a guy, a squad leader, E6, who had bought a Dodge Viper after a deployment.
Oh,
And
wow.
then it was 6 or 8 months later, and he was like, "Anybody want to buy a Viper? I'm tired of these $1,200 a month payments."
$1,200.
And I
Oof.
was just, we always tell our soldiers not to run out and buy Camaros and Chargers, and you bought a Viper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they didn't say nothing in the safety brief about Vipers.
Right.
So how long? So was the main part of that battle? You were there for 45 days, and then the rest of the time was back on the main fob. Is it?
Yeah. So really, we like I said, we had been at Taji, and we actually built a company JSS a little further north of there.
Mhm.
And we were patrolling that area, and shaking hands and having chai and all that,
Oh, good
uh,
old chai.
doing the usual stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, we got called down to Sadr City to help. And like I said, we were there for about 45 days or so, and then our company got pulled back to our battalion back up at Taji, and then back out to our own JSS. But yeah, so that 45 days really, we were living in our trucks. We were living
Yeah.
in a school that we had ended up moving into for a while, but we were not on a JSS or in a camp or anything. I mean, I spent probably 2 weeks in some family's house, like living. We kicked them out, and we were like, we live here now. And it was just my squad, like my
Yeah.
my platoon. We had another squad in a building or a house there. Of course, in Sadr City, they're all kind of attached. But like we were in this one, we had a squad in the next one, and then a squad in the one behind us, and then our vehicle crews were in the vehicles parked at the intersection in front of us. And I mean, we'd rotate out every once in a while with another platoon that would come in and take our spots, but we were just living there.
Yeah. And it's not like, living like, okay, it's the high life, I'm taking a break. No, there's still guard and
Oh yeah.
lack of sleep and everything else that's going on. We're not talking about sleeping in Saddam's palace where it's heavily guarded.
Right. No, I mean, I did appreciate, I used their shower and I slept in their bed.
Yeah, yeah. That was nice of them.
Right. Um, but yeah, and it was crazy because I mean, we had guys there was a bakery across the street in front of us, and we could see over it because we were on like the third level. And then there was a soccer field and then more apartments on the other side. And these guys would come out and wave flags around all the time. And then anytime we saw them come out and do that, we would get mortared or something right after.
Yeah, yeah,
So they had a brand new truck parked in front of the apartment place. So every time they came out, we shot their truck because rules of engagement at that time said you couldn't shoot if there was no hostile intent.
yeah.
So we couldn't prove that that's what they were doing. So we just started shooting their truck every time they came out, and they stopped coming out.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's something too. The rules of engagement changed rapidly.
Every
I
time.
mean,
Yeah.
I remember when we were kicking in doors and searching houses in both countries, and by the time we left, we were knocking on the doors and waiting for them to hide everything before we would come in. You know,
Yeah.
and they started calling it a cordon knock or something like
Yeah.
that.
Cordon and search or
Yep,
cordon and
yep. And man, the politics of that war put soldiers' lives in so much risk that
yeah.
that it completely went against risk management.
Right. And even while we were there, I mean, we went from doing some raids where we were, I mean, busting in doors and clearing everything, hot and heavy. And by the time we left, it was like, oh, anything you find needs to be documented so you can turn it into the Iraqi court system because we're going to prosecute.
Yeah,
So I'm like, wait, like we were rolling these guys up before and snatching them out of their beds and all that, and now we've got to like be polite and make sure and we always did our our sensitive site exploitation and all that. But now it's like you need specific sketches and sworn statements because we're going to turn them over to an Iraqi judge. And
Yeah.
I actually had to go testify in an Iraqi court for a guy that we rolled up. Like I was like, this
Wow.
is crazy.
I mean, that is just unreal. Why would the American government ever allow us to participate in a foreign court system?
I don't know. Like it was such a weird experience because I had to fly to Baghdad and go to the Green Zone and then ride around in a bulletproof suburban basically to go to this courthouse. And I had to go in and with an interpreter testify in court, and one of my soldiers was there with me, one of my team leaders. Um, the judge preferred our sketches to our photographs because, of course, we took photos of everything. But he didn't trust the photographs. He wanted to see our hand-drawn sketches of where we found things and the layout of the house and all that. I mean, it's so backwards. Uh, but it was some local sheikh that we had been working with for a long time, and then some guys paid him to allow them to pass so they could mortar our company JSS, and they fired like 6 or 7 mortar rounds at us. And then, of course, by the time we got clearance for counterfire from Taji from the artillery unit,
Yeah.
they were long gone.
Yeah.
But turned out that he had been paid to let them do it, which I love because I don't know what it was about that guy. He never liked me from the day we met, and I never liked him either. And it was my squad that got to bust in his door and yank him out of his bed. So I was pretty happy about that.
Hell
And then
yeah.
I got to look at him in the courtroom too, and I'm like, yeah.
Yep. And I really kind of wonder. So they find him guilty, whatever, and I wonder how long before he's back out on the streets.
Who knows?
You know,
I mean, we
I'm
searched
sure he
the
paid
house.
somebody.
Right. We did a raid on a house one time, and we had been on patrol, and we were trying to get back in time for chow, and we were told to stop because a sister company was doing a search on this house where they thought that there was some sniper activity.
Mhm.
Uh, so we get out of our trucks, and it's below freezing, and of course we're thinking we're going to be out there for an hour or two, so we didn't bring our packs or anything. We just kind of walked over and set up blocking positions behind this compound, and then we get word that they can't find anything, so they're going to wait for daylight to get better eyes on it or whatever.
Yeah.
I remember I had this private, and he started just like sniffling a little bit, and he's about ready to cry, and I'm like, I'm so glad to be here for the first time that you have ever actually sucked, like, because this sucks. But I'm like me and your team leader, like we've done this plenty of times. Like we've been where you're at, and you're going to be okay, and you're going to laugh at this someday. But right now, this is the worst experience you've ever had because it's
Yeah.
cold and you're not dressed, you know. And of course, in the morning, they didn't find anything, and we went on back to Taji at the time. Then my squad hit that house probably a month later, and we found so much shit in there. But we started off, we tried to kick in their door, and there's furniture in front of it. So they come from another door, and they're like, "Oh, come on in. We like the Americans." We start searching the house, and my company commander's like, "What have you found?" And I'm like, "I've found a few 9mm rounds and nothing else." And he's like, "Well, where's the 9mm?" And I'm like, "I don't know. They're saying they don't have it." And he was like, "Well, they've got the ammo. They've got to have the gun." And I'm like, "I can flip the place if you want." And he's like, "Flip it." So we tore that house apart, but we found, I don't know, several hundred rounds. I mean, a room full of propane tanks, and like we found Christmas lights,
Yeah. I
like
wonder. I wonder what
several
those are
strands.
for.
Right. Yeah. And there were these canisters that were the printing was in Portuguese, but you could make out that it said Brazil and that it said Warhead, and like they were just like shipping containers. There were like 5 or 6 of them. Most of them were full of ammo. And then they had these big rolls of canvas on the floor in like a junk room under piles of stuff. And like we found a sniper rifle with a scope. We found a couple of bolt action rifles. We found several AKs. And all these guys are like, "Nope, we don't have any weapons. We don't have any weapons." So I cuffed them and took them up on the roof, and I'm like where I had all their stuff laid out. And I was, I could see on their faces they were just like, "Shit." I've got great pictures of them sitting there like this with their hands together, looking at all their stuff.
Yeah, man. You
But those
know,
guys were out. I mean, we were on patrol in the same place probably 2 or 3 weeks later,
yeah,
and man, they were yelling at me because they were out already, and I was just like, "Oh, look, I trashed your house, and now you're pissed at me, and you're walking around."
yeah, yeah. That. the end of it just really started to not make sense, man.
Yeah.
You know. So, at what point did the book decide to come? Where did you decide to start this long process?
Oh man. So I like I wrote a lot of letters, and
Mm-hmm.
I always kind of enjoyed writing with people. And of course, our deployments from 2001 and 2 to 2007, 8, and 9, like we went from disposable Kodak cameras to digital cameras, and we
Yeah.
went from writing letters to having email and Skype and Iraqi cell phones.
Yep.
So it was a like totally different experience from the first time to the last time, and each
Yep.
time in between. Um, but I always kept a journal, and I wasn't great about writing in it all the time. My last deployment, I knew I was getting out, and like I had lost some friends in Iraq. Like I was in Afghanistan my second time, and one of my close friends from my first time in Afghanistan was killed in Mosul. And I knew it was going to be an experience, and I mean honestly, I kind of thought I was like, this is my fourth deployment. I'm probably going to get blown up or shot and killed over here, and never make it back.
Yeah.
Um, but I took like two notebooks with me, just big, thick, hardbound, notebooks. And I started off keeping track of what we did on patrols and like how many patrols we had done and IEDs. And it got to be just too much to even keep track of after a while.
Yeah.
But I tried to every few days sit down and write like, oh, did this, went here, this vehicle got hit, like whatever it was. I tried to just keep notes. Um, and sometimes it was just guys sitting around. I mean, I've got in there in my journal. We were comparing one night in our tent the pros and cons of prison versus deployment.
Yeah.
And really it seemed like prison kind of came out a little better. Um,
Yeah. The only thing that
but
was difference was the where the Constantine was the direction that the wires was facing.
right, right,
That's it.
it's like they got air conditioning, they can go to college. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
um, we were lifting tank wheels and brake discs and stuff. It's like they've got a gym.
Yeah.
Um, but so my soldiers always be like, why do you always carry around that stupid notebook? And I'm like, one of these days I'm going to put you in a book, and I never really thought that I would truly do it. Um, and then I always had a camera. So I took, not as many photos on those early deployments, but in Iraq, I had a digital camera and I took pictures all the time, and I would go back to my laptop that day and put them in a folder with the date on the folder. So I came home and I had my journal with, on this day, this is where we went, this is what we did. And then I had the pictures with the same date on the folder. So I could look at the pictures and really remember by putting the two things together.
Yeah.
Um, and I was going to college after I got out of the Army, and I took a class called War Stories. And we read from the American Revolution all the way up to Afghanistan. And the professor he was born in a refugee camp after the Holocaust. His parents were Jewish, and had survived. So a lot of his work is about history and writing about his parents' experiences and all that, and just things related to war. So he told me after reading some of my writing for his class, he was like, you really should consider, he's like, you obviously have a lot of stories to tell and they deserve to be told. You should consider putting them on paper. So I submitted, at his urging, I submitted just a story about Sadr City to a writing contest, and it was published. And then every year after that, when that contest came around, I submitted something else and something else and something else. And I was like, one of these days I want to write my own book, but I had no idea how to go about it.
Mhm.
It was just a few years ago, I was invited. They were looking for Sadr City veterans to go to Nashville and be in a country music video. Tara Thompson was recording a song called Sadr City. And they were like, hey, like, if you guys were in Sadr City and you want to come down, like be in this music video, you're welcome to come down. The more the merrier. And they're like, bring your stuff with you. If you've got like photos or memorabilia, anything you brought back, like bring it with you, and we'll get it all out and tell some more stories and stuff. So I got down there, and Anthony Farina, who wrote Angels in Sadr City, was there, and Boone Cutler, big veterans advocate, and he's authored several books about Sadr City. He was there, and it turns out that this old house that's been there since the Civil War, where we were filming, belonged to their publisher. And he's talking about, how he had first gotten involved with books about Sadr City, and how he was intrigued by all the fighting, and how it was kind of the pulse of Iraq. Like if shit was
Yeah.
happening in Sadr City, it was probably happening across the country. And if things were calm in Sadr City, it was probably calm across the country. So he's like, I've done so much research, and I'm so thankful that I met Boone. And Boone had been blown up early in his deployment and was having memory issues. So he started writing everything down because he couldn't remember today what happened yesterday. So he's like,
Yeah.
I had to take notes. He's like, and then I came back and I met Robbie, this publisher, and like we took my notes and made a book. And I was like, pulled out my journal because I brought it with me because they said bring pictures and stuff. And I was like, this is my journal. So Robbie sat down with me and started flipping through it. And he was like, how much of this have you ever typed it? And I was like, I've got a couple hundred pages typed, but I haven't like polished it or anything. I've just like been typing it out. And he's like, you've got a book here. Like we could put this together pretty quick. Um, and really it still took me about another year because I was, trying to fill in some gaps between stories and
Yeah.
make it where it would flow and be readable, and also I wanted to kind of tell the whole story of all of my deployments, not just Iraq.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do that through just like bits and pieces of certain experiences that stuck out to me. Obviously there's a lot of other stuff that I didn't throw in there from all those times.
Right.
But yeah, so then I mean Robbie's in Nashville and I live in Louisville. So we started talking and emailing back and forth. And then all of a sudden he sent me what I had sent to him in like an ebook format where I could flip through the pages on my computer screen. And he was like, you're almost there. Like now it's time to proofread and all that. So he, sent me some suggestions and then I would read it and I would send back suggestions and he would change it. And we were back and forth. And then I got all the way to the end to the closing chapter. And I was like, I'm stuck. Like I have all the words I want to use on the pages, but they're not in the right order and I can't figure it out. So really, I walked away for a couple of months thinking that I was probably not going to finish it. And then one day my wife was like, really, you did all this work and you're just gonna walk away from it? And I was like, all right. So I sat down one day and like finished out that last chapter and sent it to Robbie, and he sent it back and he was like, this looks great. Like you need to, give it one more read through. And we still had a few more, runs through it to
Mhm.
proofread, but he was like, stop changing, you've reached the point where you can stop changing stuff. Like now you're just reading for making sure it makes sense and making sure that you've got punctuation, spelling, and all that, which I did find a typo after it went to print. Only one, but I found it. A friend of mine read it and he was like, 211, what do you mean here? And I'm like, um, so of course that was frustrating because I wanted it to be perfect,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it's like it was a lot of emails back and forth and a lot of time writing and reading. And I'm like, I've read this book so many times, I'm tired of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally he was like, we're ready to send off for a print proof. And there were some things in the back that were, the printing and formatting didn't come out quite right. So we adjusted that and sent it off again. And it came back and I was happy with it. And that was it.
Wow,
So
man. I started a book as well, and it is, yeah, exactly how you explained, man. It is constantly going back and over. You
yeah.
know, I
But then you
think,
catch yourself changing things. It's like, oh, I don't like the way this sounds. And
yep,
then you realize you changed it back to what it was before you changed it last time,
yep.
because it's like this day it sounded better than, I don't know. Like,
No, you're absolutely right. And then I always send it. So after I do a chapter, I send it to my daughter, and I have her read it because she's not military literate.
mhm,
And the idea behind my book is, I kind of want to show the transformation of how a person goes before PTSD to after PTSD.
yeah,
And um, so I sent it to her to see if she understands it, and it answers a lot of the questions that she's had, that I didn't talk about as she was
yeah,
growing up, you know, and she's a bookworm and smart as hell. So,
right,
and she sends back, you know, a lot of good information, and I'll add it in there, and it does. It sounds a lot better.
yeah,
But yeah, we haven't even got to the point where we're starting to worry about all the little stuff yet.
right.
We're still at the beginning stages. But yeah, it's a challenge, man.
Well, I mean, it's been I enjoy writing anyway. I do. I've been fortunate to like I work in education, but I've been fortunate to find a lot of roles in education where I get to write a lot, which I enjoy.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not so good at selling. So, it's like I wrote this book and I wanted to like pay tribute to the guys we lost and the guys I served with because whether it was that first deployment and we really didn't see a ton of action, or it was the last deployment and we saw quite a bit of action, like they were still there. They
Yeah.
still signed up, they still went and they did their jobs as they were asked to do.
Yeah.
Um, so like I wanted to applaud them and pay tribute to them. But also like you said, I mean, my son's 18 and my daughter's 12. I wanted to leave something for them to
Yep.
be able to reflect back on and maybe answer some questions that they had or whatever. I mean, not that I'm planning on going anywhere anytime soon, but like I wanted to leave something,
Yep.
that's like this is what I did, this is what I went through, and also like this probably explains like why I'm pissed off sometimes.
Yep. Yeah. And that was my motivation for starting this book, and one of my passions is doing these podcasts and talking with veterans and everything else. And I was like, I spend all this time talking with everybody else, but I've never really sat down with my kids and even my wife, and really explained the things that had happened. So that was where the motivation for the book came from.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know my wife is always, yeah, anytime I'm around other veterans, whether it's people I served with or just other veterans, yeah, will be leaving and she'll be like, well, I never heard that story before. I didn't know you did that, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I didn't think of it. Like, it's not like I came home with a laundry list of things to tell you about.
Yeah.
Like sometimes someone else's story reminds me of something or whatever. Um, and like I've never been shy about talking about it. Like I went to school after the army to become a history teacher, and people are like, "Why history?" And I'm like, "War was kind of fun. It was exciting, and like now I get to talk about it all the time."
Yeah.
I'm like cracking. I'm getting my fix.
Yeah.
Um,
And I do believe at some point, you can't have a 20-year war that's not going to be in the history books.
yeah,
These wars are going to be talked about. I
and
don't.
that was this visit we just had to Fort Drum. My son was born in Hawaii, so he was never at Fort Drum. Um, but we walked into the battalion headquarters and like, there's pictures of me on the wall in Afghanistan from that first tour. And then when we got down to the company headquarters, there were all kinds of pictures of me and my guys, but also some of the guys that we were renting the house with, and we stayed up till 5 in the morning playing poker with the night before. Like we're plastered all over the walls.
Yeah.
And I was like, what a cool thing for my son to see that like,
Yeah.
this army unit has pictures of his old man on the wall,
Yeah.
like I don't
Yeah.
know, I don't know. It made me feel some kind of way.
Oh yeah, I completely get it, man. And just like you said, it doesn't matter what your MOS was, what your job was, how many times you deployed, whether you deployed or didn't deploy. You know, I applaud anybody, especially the new recruits that volunteered after the war started.
Yeah,
Because they knew what they were getting into,
right.
and it wasn't like, I came in '94. I came in because I needed a job and had a family to take care of, but it wasn't like I was really worried about war because nothing had been going on for so long, man.
Right. And I was kind of the same way in 2000. I mean, I remember my mom and my girlfriend at the time, who I'm still married to. She was, they're like, well, what are you going to do? What if something happens? Like, and I'm like, what's going to happen? Like, I'm going to sign up for 4 years. I'm going to get my college paid for, and like, I'm going to serve and probably do some cool stuff. Like, I might go to Kosovo or Bosnia or something, or Kuwait, and I'm like,
Yeah,
that'll be it. Like that. And then 9/11 happened, and yeah, I was like, oh, like we are going.
yeah. And I think everybody that day that was watching, like I still remember I was at work and PT was during personal hygiene time, so it was almost 9 o'clock, and I seen it just taking place, because we had the news
Yeah.
playing there in our motor pool, and I was like, holy shit. And then I was like, holy shit, we're going to war. I
Yeah.
mean, it just
Yeah.
hit that fast,
I was in Boston on TDY on funeral detail. We were doing, military honors for all these World War II veterans that were dying. And Fort Drum always had teams out doing that.
Yeah.
And really we stretched from like Boston to Maine. It was kind of our area. And we were in Boston that day. And I hung over because we didn't have a funeral that morning. We'd had one the day before and we had one the next day, so we didn't go back to Fort Drum. Um, and I remember my hotel room phone ringing, and they were like, "Dude, we're under attack." And I'm like, "Whatever, like, quit screwing around." And like they called back, and they're like, "No, seriously, like turn on the TV." So we went down to the hotel bar, and of course, ordered a beer and started watching what was going on. I remember this bartender, like I swear I can still see his face. He was an older guy, but had like the curled handlebar mustache. His sleeves rolled up, and he was like, "Did you say you're in the army?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we're all in the army." And he was like, "You guys are going to go to war?" And I'm like, "No, we're not." And
Yeah.
like we thought being in Fort Drum up in upstate New York, we're going to get called down to ground zero to dig through all this rubble. But that was not the plan, I guess.
Yeah. No, at that point, the war machine had been idle for so long, and let's face it, war makes money,
Oh
and
yeah, for sure.
I think there was a lot of politicians that was ready for this. Yeah,
Yep.
it definitely. I've never bought the whole story that we were there just to deal with bin Laden. You know, I think there was a much more reason, politically, why we're there.
I think there always is,
Yeah,
and
I do
and,
too.
and I don't. I mean, I'm no expert, and I honestly I try not to get into politics too much because it's just so aggravating,
Yep,
regardless of which side you're on.
yep.
Um, but I don't think that we send soldiers off to war to win anymore.
No,
I don't think we did in Vietnam. Like I think that our military absolutely had the ability to win that war.
I do
I
too.
think politicians who decided not to, and I think it was the same in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yep,
You I mean, war is essentially football, right? Like you've got to take ground and hold it.
yep.
Um, but if you're not going to do that, then you're not going to win. Like, I mean, in Vietnam, they were, trying to fight a war of attrition and focusing on body count. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, it wasn't even that. Like, I mean,
No,
they definitely told us some body counts sometimes after some engagements, but that was never even. It was never like we're going to kill as many of them as possible until they give up.
yeah,
It was we're going to stand up, a democracy here and spread our way of life to these people who need it. But honestly, I don't think they ever wanted it. I
no,
don't. I mean, I think there are some people who love Americans and would love to live the way we do. But I think that a lot of people that I talk to, and I actually have a student in my school now who is originally from Iraq, and he was probably 3 or 4 when I was over there, and he lived around Sadr City, and I showed him some pictures, and he was like that. He's like, I was back there 5 years ago. That's my aunt's neighborhood. Um, so like he and I have talked a little bit, and he was like, my family always, it's like they didn't like Saddam, but Saddam kept everything in check.
yep,
And I've heard more than one person say that like
yep,
he was bad, but he kept things going. The
yep.
kept things under control.
He was the devil that you knew.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and yeah, I mean, I feel like in Vietnam we would send troops out by helicopter to fight for a hilltop, and then they
yeah,
would get to the hilltop. They would get picked up by the helicopter and flown back to a base camp, and then go back to that same hilltop and fight again a week later for the same
yeah,
territory and do the same thing. And honestly, I feel like doing presence patrols and things in Iraq and Afghanistan is essentially the same. Like you go out, you hope you get in a fight, or you hope that you don't get in a fight, whatever the situation is, and maybe you get into a fight there, and then you go back to your camp and have steak and lobster at the chow hall, and then tomorrow you're going to go patrol the same area and potentially get into a fight in the same space. Like
yeah.
you're never going to win that way.
Yeah, and I don't like how Iraq ended. Where they had us training them to be the American army. You know,
Yeah,
they didn't want us there. I mean,
right.
literally, I remember several times that we were told we had to give classes on maintenance and logistics and stuff, and it was literally like the ship burning detail. Hey, go grab that private and have him sit over here, and we'd be like training one guy who didn't speak any English with no
Right.
interpreter. It
Yep.
was just a complete waste of time. You
Well, and
know,
it's such a different culture too. Like they're not loyal to their country.
yeah,
They're loyal to their community, their family, their clan, whatever you want to break it down to. That's where their loyalty lies
right,
first. It's
yeah,
not, like if I'm an Iraqi soldier, like my loyalty does not necessarily lie with Iraq. And of course,
yep,
I worked with the Afghan army some. I worked with the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police, and like I never trusted a one of them.
hell no,
They stole equipment from us. They
yeah,
were, in my opinion, and based on my culture and my military experience, they were lazy.
yep.
They were not interested in doing work, and when it got dangerous, they disappeared.
They
Um,
were loyal to who they thought was going to win. That's
mhm.
that was it. whoever
or
was in their
who
face
was
at that
giving them
time.
the most, you
Yep.
know. And honestly, like I always joked when I was a squad leader in Iraq. I remember telling some major one day, I was like, you want to train the Iraqi army and create esprit de corps and loyalty within their unit and loyalty to their country. I'm like, pick up this platoon, fly them to Afghanistan and drop them with an American platoon in Afghanistan and bring an Afghan army platoon and drop them here in Iraq. I was like, because then they have to rely on each other to survive. You know, they're
Yep.
not around their people. I'm like, let's take all the Iraqi army to Afghanistan and all the Afghan army to Iraq and let them figure it out that way. I was like,
Yeah.
and then when they come home, they will be a tight knit unit.
Yeah. I've never thought about that, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
And
Well,
that was always my argument as a young staff sergeant.
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Jarrod, I appreciate you coming on, man. So
Appreciate you having me.
no issue, man, but I got one more request.
Yeah,
Can you send me your address? I'm gonna send you this book and have you sign it, man.
yeah, for sure, totally happy to do it.
Yep, I'll send it to you and it'll be up. I'm moving into an actual studio, so
Wow,
we're getting ready to start moving and everything. So it'll
that's
be sitting up behind me on a shelf
well,
for everybody to see. But
that's cool. I
for the people
appreciate it.
watching, man, go to Amazon or wherever you get your books. No shit, here I am. It is a great book, man. Absolutely awesome.
I really appreciate it, and I wish you luck with yours. I hope you get it done and out in print.
I hope so too, man. I hope so. So, well, I'm gonna let you go. Once we stop recording, just hang on for a second, all right?
Sure.
You take care.